Daniel Marsh was a chemist at a generic pharmaceutical factory on the outskirts of a large, anonymous city. He was also a single father to a 7-year-old girl named Chloe. His life was a quiet routine of early mornings, late shifts, and bedtime stories. Chloe was his everything. She had a laugh that could fill their small apartment, and she loved drawing pictures of rivers and trees. Daniel had worked at the factory for 9 years, never asking questions, just following safety protocols and mixing compounds. But one Tuesday afternoon, while running an unauthorized test on a water sample taken from the factory's drainage pipe, he discovered something terrible. The sample contained a toxic byproduct called XT7, a substance that was supposed to be neutralized before disposal. The factory had been dumping it directly into the river that flowed past the industrial zone, the same river that supplied drinking water to a small town 20 kilometers downstream. Daniel knew XT7, he had studied its effects in college. It attacked kidney cells slowly, silently, over months of exposure. Children were especially vulnerable because their bodies were still developing. A cold dread settled into his stomach, because Chloe had been complaining of back pain for weeks, and her doctor had ordered blood tests. He rushed home that evening and found Chloe sitting on the couch, pale and tired. She had missed school again. The doctor's call came an hour later. Chloe's kidney function was below normal. The diagnosis was early-stage renal damage, cause unknown. But Daniel knew the cause. He spent the night searching through the factory's old reports, which he had saved on a personal drive. The evidence was clear. The company had disabled the neutralization system 3 years ago to save money. The waste had been flowing into the river ever since. The town downstream had seen a 300% increase in childhood kidney illnesses. Daniel printed everything: lab results, internal emails, maintenance logs. He placed the papers in a folder and drove to the factory the next morning, determined to confront his boss. Philip Hale was the plant manager, a man in his late 50s with silver hair and a smile that never reached his eyes. He sat behind a large desk, and when Daniel explained what he had found, Hale's smile did not waver. He said, "Daniel, you are a good chemist, but you do not understand business. That neutralization system costs $500,000 a year to run. The river dilutes the waste to safe levels. Nobody has proven any connection to illnesses." Daniel pushed back, showing the data, the emails, the town's hospital records. Hale's smile finally vanished. He stood up, walked to the door, and called security. Within an hour, Daniel was escorted out of the building, accused of stealing confidential documents. The folder of evidence was taken from him, and he was told he was fired for gross misconduct. When he tried to call a lawyer, his phone buzzed with a notification: his personal drive had been remotely wiped. Philip Hale had connections. He had people who could hack into a former employee's computer. Daniel stood on the street outside the factory, holding nothing but his car keys and a broken heart. He had no job, no evidence, and a daughter who was getting sicker. He went home and sat in the dark, watching Chloe sleep. The doctors said she would need expensive treatment, possibly a transplant. Daniel had no savings, no health insurance after the firing, and no way to fight a corporation with unlimited resources. He thought about going to the police, but the police would need proof. He thought about going to the newspapers, but Hale would deny everything and sue him for defamation. He thought about running away, but where? For 3 days, he did nothing except take Chloe to appointments and stare at the ceiling. Then, on the 4th night, Daniel remembered something. He had not just been a quality control chemist, he had also been part of the research team that developed a harmless reagent called Compound B. Compound B was designed to detect the presence of heavy metals in water by turning bright blue. It was non-toxic, biodegradable, and extremely sensitive. And it reacted specifically with the same molecular structure as Xt7. Daniel realized that if he could produce a large quantity of compound B and introduce it into the factory's wastewater system, the entire river downstream would turn a vivid, unmistakable blue. The pollution would become visible to everyone: the town, the media, the environmental agencies. No amount of corporate denial could hide a blue river. But producing compound B required access to a lab, and Daniel no longer had one. He also needed a way to inject the compound into the factory's pipes without being caught. The plan was dangerous and illegal. He would be committing industrial sabotage, a federal crime. Yet, as he watched Chloe wince in her sleep, he made a choice. He would not be a hero. He would be a criminal, but he would be a criminal who saved his daughter's life. The next morning, he called the only person he still trusted, Thomas Werner, an old friend from university who worked as a public defender. Thomas listened to Daniel's story in silence, then said, "Daniel, what you are describing is a felony. You could go to prison for years." Daniel replied, "I know. But Chloe will die if I do nothing." Thomas sighed and agreed to help, but only to advise on minimizing legal damage. He would not participate in the sabotage. Over the next 2 weeks, Daniel worked in secret. He rented a small storage unit and converted it into a makeshift lab using second-hand equipment bought with cash from his savings. He synthesized compound B in batches, testing each one to ensure purity. It was slow, painstaking work, and he slept only a few hours each night. Chloe stayed with a neighbor, who asked no questions. Meanwhile, Daniel studied the factory's layout from old blueprints he had memorized. He discovered that the main drainage pipe had an emergency access point in a forgotten maintenance tunnel behind the factory. The tunnel was unlocked, unguarded, and not covered by security cameras. He would have one chance to pour the compound into the pipe at exactly the right moment, when the factory's pumps were at their lowest pressure. That would allow the compound to spread evenly through the wastewater without being diluted too quickly. On the night of the operation, Daniel packed 5 large canisters of compound B into the back of his car. He drove to the factory at 2 a.m, parked behind an abandoned warehouse, and carried the canisters one by one to the maintenance tunnel. The tunnel was dark and smelled of rust. He found the access valve, opened it, and began pouring. The liquid was clear and odorless, but he knew what it would become. He worked quickly, his hands steady despite his racing heart. After 45 minutes, all 5 canisters were empty. He closed the valve, wiped down his prints, and walked back to his car. As he drove away, he looked in the rearview mirror and saw nothing but darkness. The compound would take 6 hours to travel through the pipes and reach the river. By sunrise, the river would turn blue. Daniel went home and held Chloe's hand until dawn. Then he turned on the television. The morning news was chaos. A reporter stood on the bank of the river, and behind her, the water was a brilliant, unnatural blue. It stretched as far as the camera could see, like a giant liquid sapphire. The reporter said that environmental teams were already on site, and that the color was not fading. Early tests showed no toxicity, but the cause was a mystery. Within 2 hours, the story went viral. Drones flew over the river, capturing images that looked like art installations. Social media exploded with theories: an algae bloom, a chemical spill, a protest stunt. But then a local doctor from the downstream town posted a video comparing the river's color to the exact shade of blue that appeared in a known heavy metal detection test. The doctor had once worked in a lab and recognized the reaction. He said, "Someone has revealed the truth. That blue means the water is contaminated with industrial waste." Philip Hale went into crisis mode. He held a press conference denying any wrongdoing, claiming the factory's waste was treated properly. He suggested that environmental activists had deliberately dyed the river to frame the company. But his voice cracked, and his smile was gone. Meanwhile, journalists swarmed the town, interviewing parents of sick children. A mother showed medical records for her 8-year-old son, who had been diagnosed with kidney disease the same month the factory disabled its neutralization system. Another family produced water bills and maps showing that their well had been contaminated by runoff. The evidence, hidden for years, was now being dragged into the light by ordinary people who had finally found a reason to speak. Daniel watched from his apartment, his heart pounding. He had not expected the reaction to be so fast or so fierce. He also knew that it was only a matter of time before someone traced the compound back to him. Compound B was not a secret formula, it was known in the industry, but its production required expertise. Anyone investigating would look for chemists who had recently left the factory under suspicious circumstances. Daniel was the only one. He called Thomas Werner and said, "I need to turn myself in." Thomas replied, "Not yet. Let the story grow. The more public pressure, the better your legal defense." But Daniel could not wait. He had seen the news reports of children being admitted to hospitals, their faces pale like Chloe's. He felt a strange mix of guilt and pride. He had committed a crime, but he had also started something that could save hundreds of lives. On the third day after the Blue River appeared, Daniel walked into the local police station. He asked to speak to a detective, and he confessed everything. He showed them the remaining compound B in his storage unit, the equipment he had used, and the detailed notes he had kept. He explained why he had done it, and he provided the names of the doctors who could confirm Chloe's condition. The detective listened, then sighed. He said, "Mr. Marsh, what you did was illegal. You sabotaged private property and caused a public disturbance. But I have a daughter too. I will make sure your statement is recorded accurately." Daniel was arrested and charged with industrial sabotage, vandalism, and unlawful discharge of a chemical agent. Bail was set high, but Thomas Werner argued that Daniel was not a flight risk because of his sick daughter. The judge reduced bail, and Daniel was released pending trial, under house arrest with an ankle monitor. The news of Daniel's arrest broke the same day. Public opinion was divided. Some called him a hero, a modern-day Robin Hood who used science to fight corruption. Others called him a dangerous vigilante who had taken the law into his own hands. Philip Hale's lawyers immediately issued a statement saying that Daniel was a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge, and that the Blue River was a hoax designed to extort the company. But the environmental agency had already tested the water and found traces of XT7. The factory was shut down pending a full investigation. Hale was questioned for hours, and his emails were subpoenaed. The truth could no longer be buried. Chloe, meanwhile, began treatment at a specialized clinic paid for by a crowdfunding campaign that started after Daniel's story went viral. Strangers from around the world donated money. A famous actor tweeted about the case, calling Daniel a father who did what no one else would. Within a month, Chloe's kidney function stabilized. The doctors said she would need ongoing care, but she would not die. Daniel wept when he heard the news, his ankle monitor scratching against his leg. He was allowed supervised visits with Chloe, and he spent every allowed minute reading to her, drawing with her, and watching her laugh again. She did not understand why her father had a bracelet that beeped, but she knew he had done something important. She drew a picture of a blue river with a smiling sun, and she gave it to him. The trial was scheduled for 6 months later. Thomas Werner prepared a defense based on necessity. Daniel had broken the law to prevent greater harm to his daughter and to hundreds of other children. The prosecution argued that Daniel could have gone to the media or to regulators instead of taking illegal action. But Thomas presented evidence that Daniel had tried to go through proper channels, and that Philip Hale had destroyed that evidence and fired him. The jury was shown the factory's internal emails, recovered by forensic accountants. The emails proved that Hale had personally ordered the neutralization system disabled and had instructed subordinates to falsify reports. Hale was arrested separately on charges of environmental crimes and fraud. Daniel's trial became a media sensation. Every seat in the courtroom was filled. Chloe sat in the front row, holding a stuffed bear. The prosecutor questioned Daniel for hours, trying to paint him as an unstable extremist. But Daniel remained calm, answering every question with quiet honesty. He said, "I am not a hero. I am a father who was given no other choice. I broke the law, and I accept the consequences. But I would do it again to save my daughter." The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the verdict was guilty on the charge of vandalism, but not guilty on the more serious charge of industrial sabotage. The judge sentenced Daniel to 18 months in a minimum security prison, with credit for time served under house arrest. He would serve 10 more months. It was a light sentence, and the judge cited Daniel's clean record, his cooperation, and the extraordinary circumstances. Philip Hale was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. The factory was permanently closed, and the land was designated for environmental cleanup. The town downstream received government funding for a new water treatment plant and a children's health program. And the river slowly returned to its natural color, but the people who lived nearby never forgot the day it turned blue. They called it the Blue River Rebellion, and they told their children the story of the chemist who broke the law to save them. Daniel Marsh reported to the Federal Correctional Facility on a cold Monday morning. He had said goodbye to Chloe the night before, holding her tighter than he ever had. She was staying with Thomas Werner and his family, and she had a new doctor who visited twice a week. Chloe did not cry. She was 7, but she understood that her father was going away to a place with walls, and that he would come back. She gave him a drawing of a blue river and a man with a smile. Daniel folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket. The prison was a low-security camp surrounded by fences but no towers. The inmates were mostly white-collar criminals, embezzlers, fraudsters, and a few environmental activists. Daniel was assigned to a dormitory with 12 other men. On his first night, he lay on his thin mattress and stared at the ceiling. He thought about Chloe, about the factory, about Philip Hale. He felt no regret, only a deep, tired peace. Prison life was monotonous but not brutal. Daniel worked in the kitchen during the day, and in the evenings he tutored other inmates in basic chemistry. Some of them were curious about the Blue River story, and Daniel told them the truth without embellishment. He became known as the chemist, a quiet man who had done something crazy for his daughter. The other inmates respected him, and no one bothered him. He received letters from Chloe every week, written in wobbly crayon. She told him about school, about the new puppy Thomas had given her, about how her back no longer hurt. Daniel wrote back every night, filling pages with stories and jokes. He also received a letter from a mother in the downstream town, thanking him for saving her son's life. He kept that letter under his pillow. 3 months into his sentence, Daniel was visited by a journalist named Rebecca Klein. She was writing a book about environmental whistleblowers, and she wanted to interview him. Daniel agreed, but only if she would not sensationalize his story. They talked for 2 hours in the prison's visiting room. Rebecca asked him if he regretted the sabotage. Daniel said, "I regret that it was necessary. I regret that a father has to break the law to protect his child from a company that broke the law first. That is not justice, that is a failure of the system." Rebecca wrote down every word, and her book became a bestseller. It did not make Daniel a celebrity, he did not want that. But it did spark a national conversation about corporate accountability and environmental protection. New laws were proposed, and one of them, the Blue River Act, required factories to install tamper-proof waste monitoring systems. Daniel served his full sentence without incident. On the day of his release, Thomas Werner picked him up at the prison gate. Chloe was in the back seat, holding a new drawing. She had grown taller, and her face was full of color. She jumped into Daniel's arms and did not let go for a long time. He cried, and she cried, and Thomas pretended to look at his phone. They drove to a small house that Thomas had rented for them in a quiet neighborhood. Daniel had no job, no savings, and a criminal record. But he had his daughter, and she was healthy. That was enough. The first few months were hard. Daniel applied for dozens of jobs, but every employer rejected him when they saw his conviction. He could no longer work as a chemist because his license had been suspended. He took odd jobs, cleaning, delivery driving, night security. He did not complain. He came home every evening and helped Chloe with her homework. They cooked together, watched cartoons, and planted flowers in the tiny backyard. The Blue River drawing hung on the refrigerator, faded but still bright. One afternoon, Daniel received a letter from a non-profit organization that advocated for environmental justice. They had read about his case, and they wanted to offer him a position as a technical consultant. The pay was low, but the work was meaningful. Daniel accepted without hesitation. He spent the next 2 years traveling to small towns, testing water samples, and teaching communities how to detect industrial pollution. He never used Compound B again. He worked within the law, filing reports with regulators and helping lawyers build cases. He became respected, not as a hero, but as a knowledgeable and honest man. Chloe grew older, and she began to understand what her father had done. She was proud of him, but she also worried. She asked him once, "Dad, would you do it again?" Daniel looked at her for a long moment, then said, "I hope I never have to. But if someone poisoned your river again, I would find another way. A better way." 5 years after the Blue River incident, Philip Hale was released on parole. He had served 6 years of his 7-year sentence. He gave a single interview in which he expressed no remorse, blaming his subordinates for the pollution. The interview was widely condemned, and Hale disappeared from public view. Daniel did not care. He had moved on. He was no longer the desperate father in a storage unit, he was a man who had rebuilt his life from the ground up. He had friends, a steady job, and a daughter who was about to enter middle school. The river was clean, and the children of the downstream town no longer got sick. One evening, Daniel and Chloe walked along the riverbank. The water was clear and dark, reflecting the setting sun. Chloe pointed to a spot where the blue had once been brightest. She said, "I remember when you made the river blue." Daniel smiled. "You were very sick then." Chloe nodded. "But you fixed it." Daniel put his arm around her. "No," he said. "You fixed me." They stood in silence, watching the water flow. A family of ducks paddled past, and Chloe laughed. Daniel thought about the night he had poured those canisters into the pipe, how his hands had shaken, how he had been sure he would be caught. He had been caught, and he had paid the price. But Chloe was alive, and the river was alive, and that was the only justice that mattered. The story of Daniel Marsh did not end with a parade or a medal. He never received a formal pardon, though many petitions were signed. His criminal record remained, a permanent scar. But he learned to live with it, just as the river learned to flow clean again. He sometimes gave talks at schools, telling students that the law is important, but that sometimes the law fails. He always added that breaking the law should never be the first choice, only the last. And he always showed them a photograph of Chloe from the year she was sick, pale and thin, and then a photograph from the year after, laughing in a field of flowers. Years later, a documentary was made about the Blue River Rebellion. Daniel was interviewed for it, sitting on his porch with Chloe beside him, now a teenager. The interviewer asked him what he wanted people to remember. Daniel thought for a moment, then said, "I want them to remember that one person can make a difference, but that difference comes with a cost. I paid my cost, and I would pay it again. Not because I am brave, but because I am a father. And fathers do not let their children die when there is still something left to try." The documentary ended with a shot of the river, clear and blue only in the reflection of the sky. A subtitle appeared, "The river never turned blue again." But the people never forgot. Daniel Marsh lived a quiet life after that. He never sought fame, and he never regretted his choice. He watched Chloe graduate from high school, then college. She became a doctor, specializing in pediatric nephrology. On her first day of work, she hung a frame drawing on her office wall, a blue river, a smiling sun, and a stick figure holding a little girl's hand. Beneath it, she had written, "For my father, who taught me that love is worth breaking the rules."